I want to talk to you about paying taxes if you are paid under the table. I mean, this is an important topic. So here's the approach I want you to really follow here. So getting paid under the table can feel like a win-win situation. After all, with no record of your income, you're now responsible for paying taxes on it, and neither is your employer, right? But the problem is somebody's losing in this situation, the IRS. And when the IRS loses, they get mad and audit and fine and blah, blah, blah. The last thing you know, you might end up in jail. So, so the thing is that if you are getting paid right now under the table, this does not give you a really a great situation when you really think about it in the long run. And so if you are in this situation, here is how to actually make it as easy and possible for on yourself, but also for your boss to make sure that you are compliant with the IRS. So let's talk about the first thing first. You got to know the difference between getting paid in cash and getting paid under the table. There are huge differences here. So first of all, it's worth noting that getting paid in cash is not illegal, but getting paid under the table is. So what's really the difference? Well, when you really think about it, getting paid in cash obviously means you are getting paid with physical dollar, right? Dollar bills. But this can still be considered legal if your employer is complying with the employment laws and properly tracking your payments for tax purposes. This means that when they pay you, they should be keeping a record of it, and depending on what type of employee you are, you withholding taxes and paying employer taxes like Social Security and Medicare. So getting paid under the table means that you are getting paid in cash and your employer is not keeping a record of it, likely because they're trying to save money and time by not having to do all those things. So when you start a new job and learn you'll be paid in cash, ask your employer whether they'll be tracking your income and withholding taxes. So this will help you understand whether they are being above the bar or not and help you know how to prepare. So if you suspect your employer is paying you under the table, you might want to nicely remind them of the potential repercussions. Though, it's one of those things where you have to be a little diplomatic here because you want to keep your job. Of course, I understand that. So it's one of those things again. So you have to start the conversation early so that your employer understands that it is in his or her interest too. It has to be a win-win situation because when you get audited, it's not just you being audited, it's also your employer being audited and really being fined for tax evasion and other penalties that you can really imagine. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. So now that I have established for you that you need to understand the difference between getting paid in cash and getting paid under the table, let's really understand what type of employee you are. You gotta understand what type of employee you are, okay? So knowing whether you are considered an independent contractor or an employee is an important factor for figuring out who is supposed to be responsible for withholding your taxes and which documents you should expect come tax time. So while this may be there could be a gray area, and if you are unsure, it doesn't hurt to check with your accountant. It generally comes down to how much control over when and how you do your work the company has for you. So if the company says when and where and how you do your work, provides you with the tools you need to do the job, offers you any sort of employee benefits to you like paid vacation, and provides ongoing work that's your main source of income, you are probably considered an employee to the IRS. For example, even a waitressing job is part-time. You probably still consider an employee because your employer tells you when to be at work and dictates how you should do your job. So if you decide when and how to complete a project for this job, provide your own tools and materials, and have the opportunity to pick up many clients, you are likely an independent contractor. So this is really if you will, the difference here between being an employee or let's say an independent contractor. So both occupations may actually be paid in cash for your job, but if you are an employee, more of the responsibility is on the employer to report and withhold taxes, whereas if you are an independent contractor, that responsibility falls on you, including things like paying quarterly taxes since money is not being withheld throughout the year. So you're not really actually withholding cash, so the IRS wants to get paid anyway. So you got to really know the type of employment you're in, okay? And so it's one of those things where you have to ask questions, and you got to really also evaluate the level of autonomy that you have in doing your job. This will really let you know if you are an employer. You are an employee, or an independent contractor. So when we talk about independent contractor, there are some, at the end of the, I'll speak about that later on, you will receive a 1099 as opposed to having a W-2. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about how to file taxes if you are paid under the table. One thing I want to really insist on here is that you need to track any cash income carefully throughout the year. See, the thing is that, whatever type of employee you are, make sure to carefully track any cash income throughout the year. You can do this through an app, or you can do this in Excel, whatever, or you can even do it on a paper form, on a piece of paper. That's not a problem at all. So this is especially important if you think that your employer is not accurately tracking or is trying to get away with paying you under the table, okay? So this can be as simple as keeping a spreadsheet to track cash income anytime you receive it. And so we actually recommend noting the date, who paid it to you, and the amount. You never know. And so if you are an employee who makes a lot of your cash income through tips, your employer should require you to track and report it to them, since the IRS requires it. And you need to see if your work has let's say an electronic system for reporting tips at the end of each shift. If not, talk to your boss about how they handle monthly reporting. If they do nothing, just track it for yourself. Yes, it's a bit of a pain, but listen, it's less of a pain than getting audited. You never know. So it's one of those things where basically you just want to really create a month-to-month spreadsheet where you can record and track all the income you receive on a month-to-month basis. And it's one of those things where you want it. It's really having embracing a spirit of transparency, so that the IRS can really understand that, hey, listen, you are able to do things. You are able to comply with the law. Now, the best way to go about it is to check and see if there's any software you can use at your workplace to keep track of how much you earn in tips every day, for instance. Even better, see if you can access an electronic system of accurately tracking the amount of tips you earn at the end of your shift. So again, the bottom line here is that you want to track any cash income carefully throughout the year, so that you have an idea. So, I'm not saying you have to be 100% sure, but see, if you are 95% sure, or 98% sure, or 90% sure, that's better than being 5% sure that the IRS is asking you questions. You have no idea how much you earn during the year. That's really bad. So you want to have a clear idea, at least an approximate idea of your earnings. The next thing you want to do here, if you are trying to file taxes, if you're paid under the table, is to ask your employer for a W-2 or a 1099 NEC. So when it comes to the taxing hour, you should expect actually to get a W-2 from your employer if you are considered an employee, or a 1099 NEC if you're considered an independent contractor. And if they paid you over $600 throughout the course of the year, and it doesn't matter if they pay you via cash, check, or bank transfer, $600 is basically the amount here. So 1099 NEC stands for non-employee compensation. And so it's either W-2 or 1099 NEC. You should receive these forms for the following tax year by January 31st. And if you don't, this might be another good time to ask your employer about it and gently remind them of the penalties for not correctly tracking and filing taxes, okay? And if your employer still balks and refuses you these documents, you may think about going to the IRS to let them know something shitty is going on. But we will not actually advise you to actually follow that course. It's better to talk to an accountant, a tax preparer, a CPA, certified public accountant, first, to make sure what's going on is truly illegal, okay? But you may also choose to stay quiet and not get into that mess. Understandable. Regardless, you have one more option to make sure you don't take the fall with them when something happens. And you know what? When push comes to shove, you never know whose responsibility the IRS is going to really impose sanctions on. So that's why you want to cover your ass, so to speak. You want to make sure that you are basically on the right side of the law, right? So so you want to reach out. Again, when we talk about everything you do with your employer, please have you want to keep a written record of it. So when you ask your employer for a W-2 or a 1099 NEC, for example, you want to actually send them an email and you want to CC yourself. That way you have a paper trail of all the correspondence that you have with your employer around the issue of taxation. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about how do you file taxes if you are paid under the table. Now, it's important to understand that, whether you have to record and report the money you get under the table, the answer is totally yes. The answer is yes because, filing taxes for under the table cash is mandatory as well. However, depending on how much you earn under the table, you have 3 different tax forms you must fill, which are you have a Form 1040 Easy, Form 1040A, and Form 1040. So it's one of those 3. So when we talk about 1040 Easy, really, if you have a 1040 Easy, that's because your taxes are pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and you don't need to actually go through all the some kind of complex tax preparation service to really file your taxes. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So 1040 Easy. Now, if you make something, let's say under $600, right? If you make something like between $600 and $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, depending on your situation, you just have to file Form 1040. And again, this is actually a slightly more convoluted version than 1040 Easy, but it's still not as convoluted as is the traditional Form 1040. Now, if you get a full income from full income in cash, then you have to file the general Form 1040 that everybody files every single year. In addition, you also have to report any subsidiary income you earn, such as the tips you get if the money was not reported by your employer. And so, the point I'm trying to get here is that it's important to consult a professional tax preparer if you want a full understanding of your tax situation. It's also helpful to visit the IRS websites. And what we actually advise all our clients and business, viewers, is to actually, if you have any question, please let us know in the comment section. You can ask your question. Somebody will get back to you. Please, when you actually ask the question, you want to give us your location, so your city and state, so we have a clear idea what kind of situation we're talking about. Because when we talk about getting paid under the table and paying taxes, it's not just vis-a-vis the IRS. You also have to pay taxes to your state tax authority. So it's always a great idea for us to know where our viewers are actually hailing from, so we can advise them properly. If you are paid under the table and you need to file taxes, you can file your cash income as miscellaneous income. So even if your employer refuses to properly report these payments, you should report that income yourself. So if they ever do get in trouble, you can show you paid your taxes fair and square, right? It's all about, again, going back to what I said earlier, it's all about covering your ass. And the thing is, you do not want to lose your job, so you do not want to actually confront your employer. You can actually just let it go, but pay your taxes as if nothing happened, okay? So, but the way you do this is to actually report that income as miscellaneous income, so you pay taxes on it. And luckily for you, it's important to understand that you've made it easy on yourself by tracking your cash income throughout the year, right? That's what I was telling you. It's important to really track your income throughout the year, so you have a clear idea how much you have received in under the table cash. So you want to tally up all the different cash receipts that you actually have gotten, and you want to file that sum as miscellaneous income using Form 1040 Schedule C. Okay. So one thing I want to say here is that it's not illegal though to pay someone in cash, but it is illegal to pay them without tracking the income and paying taxes on that income. If you are an employee, you should really expect to receive a W-2 from your employer at tax time. If you are an independent contractor who's been paid over $600, again, remember the threshold, $600, you should expect a 1099 NEC. If you do not receive any of those, you always have the option to track the income yourself and file as miscellaneous income on Form 1040. The one thing I also want to say here is that when we talk about Schedule C, Form 1040, that's obviously for federal, right? But you also have to think about the state income taxes here. So if you are a resident of one state, you need to, and that state really requires its residents to pay income taxes. You also have to pay taxes on that income. If you have work in more than one state, you also have to pay income to all the states where you actually have established some kind of economic activity throughout the year. Maybe you were working there, maybe you were commuting to, like, whatever it is, you need to consider paying also state taxes. Let me give you a few pro tips here before we close to this conversation. So when we talk about filing taxes, if you are paid under the table, you don't have to worry about being paid in cash. As long as you pay your taxes, and as long as your employer adheres to all of the tax and employment laws and records, and it's important to understand that you need to just make sure that your employer records all of his payments or her payments to you. Okay, it's all about actually tallying things up. And so it's in the spirit of transparency. You want to actually tally things up at the employer level or at your individual level. So you got to be clear. So if the IRS comes knocking on your door and asking questions, you have all the answers that they're looking for. Right? It's all about being prepared. And how do you become prepared if you're not tracking things up? You need to track things so you have a clear idea how much you received, how much you spent. See, the thing is, the good thing about tracking things up is that you are able to also track your expenses up as well. So when you can track your revenue, but you can also track your expenses. So at the end of the year, when you actually file your Form 1040 Schedule C and you report the income as miscellaneous income, you also can report some deductions. You can actually write certain things off depending upon your tax situation, your tax filing situation. So, but the bottom line here is that in the spirit of transparency, you always want to record things. You always want to, or you always need to also have the paper trail. And this is actually a win-win for you and win-win for your employer also, because again, if God forbid, if they were audited, at least you can say, you know what, I comply with the law on my end, and basically, if your employer is not complying with the law, then they have to actually suffer the consequences, right? And so when we talk about suffering the consequences, you know that when it comes to IRS penalties, it's really crazy high. I mean, what they charge in terms of interest rate is just crazy. So you do not want to actually mess up with the authorities on that front. Pay your taxes and try to really be forthcoming, trying to be proactive. That's the key word here. Be proactive and report income on your own if your employer does not do it. Okay, so and you want to report this income and you want to do it consistently. So if you're paid under the table, let's say for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you realize that your employer is not really reporting your data to the IRS, then you report the data yourself, or you just change jobs, just switch jobs. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I was just talking to you about how do you file taxes if you are paid under the table. And let me do a quick recap here. So I give you the approach, and then I give you a few pro tips. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.